I think that we embraced, in a way, much more than the Americans did, this notion that markets were the solution to all energy questions. And I'm not saying that markets aren't the solution to some energy questions, but the idea that the state can just be completely largely hands off, and that doesn't have to deal with geopolitical risk and supply chain risk. I think that that's turned out to be an incredibly dangerous illusion, and naive as well.
Welcome to Merryn Talks Money, the podcast in which people who know the markets explain the markets. I am Merryn Somerset Webb, and with me today I have Professor Helen Thompson. She is a professor of political economy at the University of Cambridge, and she concentrates on the political economy of energy, which is useful stuff at the moment. She is also the author of Disorder, Hard Times in the 21st Century, which is an excellent book I strongly recommend to all of you, which will help us all get to grips with the multi-crises of our age, published in 2022, and no shortage of crises since then, of course. So I'm hoping that what you'll get from this podcast is a fuller understanding of exactly what is going on in global energy markets and how it is going to affect you. Basically, perfect Easter weekend listening. Helen, thank you for joining us.
Absolute pleasure to be with you, Merryn.
Yeah, now we last saw each other at the Weekend of Mistakes in Hay-on-Wye a couple of weeks ago, and I missed your session, which was irritating for me. So I've asked you on so that, basically I can have you all to myself for 40 minutes, no one else here, and that our audience can understand some of your amazing insights into what on earth is going on. So I guess let's start with that. This war with Iran, how do you see it? How is it going? How might it end? And what will the long-term consequences be? That is a huge question. So take it from whatever angle you like.
Okay. Well, I think that in part, the motives of the Trump administration, are relatively straightforward, and they're supported by Israel, and that is they want very seriously to deplete Iranian military power, and that goes beyond the nuclear weapons issue. It goes to destroying or trying to destroy Iran's ability to do the kind of things that it's done in the first part of this war, which is inflict significant damage on its neighbors from the Arab states, the Gulf Arab states, to Israel. The question of whether the Americans had a sustained and worked out ambition for regime change, I think is a lot more complicated question. I think though, regardless of the military ambition and regardless of the regime change ambition, this is part of a bigger picture. It's part of an attempt by the Trump administration, or at least we should seriously consider at least the possibility that it's part of an attempt by the Trump administration to reset the energy part of the world geopolitically. And I think that has been a thread through Trump too. I think it's what makes sense of the intervention in Venezuela. And it makes sense of the attempts to destabilize Greenland. And that is that the Trump administration thinks through the lens of resource competition. It thinks through the lens of the vulnerabilities of itself and China to resource disruption. It experienced for itself a pretty significant resource disruption last year in the way that China handled the rare earths issue after Trump turned to the trade war. Indeed, I would say that actually they were taken aback by what happened there, and that in part there is a sense, I think, in which they have wanted retaliation for that, of disrupting China's energy security in the way in which their rare earth security was disrupted last year. And it's not a coincidence in that respect then that the major moves have been made this year, first against Venezuela and against Iran. And these are states in which China has had long-term energy alliances and has some dependency, obviously more so in the case of Iran than in the case of Venezuela.
How dependent is China on Middle Eastern oil and on Venezuelan oil?
It's a tiny amount now on Venezuela, or a relatively small amount on Venezuela. But China is the biggest single importer now of hydrocarbons through the Persian Gulf. Now, obviously, China's strategy, and what China's doing in the Western Hemisphere, and it's in the Middle East, and it's got its energy trade with Russia, has been to have diversity of energy supply. So actually, to disrupt China's energy security from this mindset, you have to do quite a bit of disrupting. And in terms of electricity, China can always fall back on coal and domestically mined coal. So this is quite a complicated, long-term issue. I do think, though, if we put these things together, we can say that the situation in the Persian Gulf has been unstable for some time. There was a big crisis in 2019, September of 2019, when the Iranians hit major Saudi oil facility. In the end, that's what led a few months later to the Trump administration assassinating Soleimani. But a situation in which you have a nuclear ambitious Iran, plus the preponderance of hydrocarbon exports from the Persian Gulf going to Asia and particularly to China, whilst the United States is the maritime power in the Persian Gulf and has the majority of the bases in the military bases in the Persian Gulf. I think that was never going to be a stable scenario, and certainly not one when you also bring Israel's interests into play. And in a situation in which Iran had taken a major strategic blow, really, certainly from 2024, from the Israeli pager attack on Hezbollah, but one could argue really in a way from the moment of the Hamas attack on Israel in October of 2023, things have been going wrong for Iran. I think it's been quite surprising in some ways, whoever was the president, for there not to have been a US move to try to reconfigure the situation, the balance of power in the Persian Gulf.
So how do you think it ends? I mean, for someone who's not expert in the Middle East, not expert in warfare, not expert in any of those things, it's very hard to tell because so much of the analysis of this war seems so political and so based on opinion rather than actuality. It's very hard to see exactly how this is going and how it might end.
Well, I think there's another reason that isn't really being commented upon as much as it should be as to why it's hard to work out how it ends. Is what is it that the Iranian regime is now? Is there an Iranian regime in a strong sense of the meaning of the word, regime, or are there actually a lot of decentralized bits of power around the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps? And if there isn't actually a meaningful regime in Iran any longer, then reaching any kind of settlement becomes actually extraordinarily difficult, and it becomes a situation in which you can expect there to be chaos, I think, for some time to come. So I think that if we think about it in those terms, then even the idea of the war ending becomes quite difficult. It can be much reduced in terms of hostilities, but without a cohesive regime in Iran, then the idea of there being peace, I think, and a settlement is quite hard to imagine.
Okay, so we should, when we think about the world and energy, we should think about this going on for a long time. We should stop thinking that this is a 6-week business or an 8-week business, that this supply crunch is long term.
Well, I think that there's various bits to this that go on in a way on the energy side, regardless of, even if it weren't true what I've just said about what is the nature of the Iranian regime, and that is the energy infrastructure that has been hit. It's particularly, I think, significant for Qatar in terms of its liquefied natural gas facilities. That's why it's declared force majeure on some of its contracts. It's significant in terms of the facilities, the refining and processing facilities in the Gulf states, including the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait. The Saudis have got thus far, in a way, the best way out in terms of their immediate, interest, because they do have a pipeline, to the Red Sea, albeit that it can't fully compensate for what they would export through the Strait of Hormuz. But I think that they're not going to go back to the idea that exporting through the Strait of Hormuz is something that they can take for granted. In the same way, I think China is not going to go back to assuming that importing through the Strait of Hormuz is something that they can take for granted. They have, I think, quite a strong incentive now where gas is concerned to think again about doing the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline with the Russians. I think we have to understand is that a shock in the Strait of Hormuz is not something that the world economy has experienced like this before. And that affects the calculations of all the players, the exporters, the importers, and the possibility that it can happen again is something that they will have to adjust to. And that's before, as I say, we get on to the actual damage to the oil and gas industry in quite a number of countries in the Gulf.
Yeah. So even if the whole thing, by some kind of miracle, everything stopped tomorrow, there is no returning to normal from here.
I don't think there is. There's certainly not, I think, in terms of the geopolitical assumptions around it. And for Qatar, I think that the from what we can tell anyway, is the damage looks quite considerable. And I think for Qatar as well, I think we really should focus on for Qatar, because for them, this is like not just a material blow, but it's a staggering, like, existential, psychological blow. Qatar has been a nominal, at least, Iranian ally, and the Iranians hit, major targets, not like they did in the war back in June of 2025 when they hit a US airbase in Qatar. No, they hit the Qataris' own gas facilities. And I think if you look at the ways in which the Qatari government have talked about that in the days after that attack, one of them said something like, never in his wildest nightmares has it occurred to him that a fellow Muslim country in the month of Ramadan will do that to Qatar. That is a major turning point, I think, for the way in which Qatar can think about the geopolitics of the Middle East. It can't go back to assuming that there's some normality to which it can return.
And again, as you say, it's very hard to imagine what the motives of the Iranian regime is, because we're not sure there is a regime.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the consequences that we can see now, and we can already see across Southeast Asia fairly major fuel and energy rationing going on. So we've seen that, and we can begin to feel that wave heading towards Europe, right? And one of the things that we're already seeing that you can see people talking about on social media, for example, is the very sharp rise in the price of flights. So we know that there's a shortage of jet fuel coming, and we're already in the UK beginning to see lines at fuel stations as people begin to feel a little panic. And then, of course, we will bit by bit we will see the rise in energy prices feeding through into the price of absolutely everything, because that's just the way this works. How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we in Europe have been relatively protected so far, both in terms of the prices. I mean, if you look, they've come down now, the difference, but there was a really big difference between the Indian price index and the Brent price for oil until the last few days. And in terms of when the last tankers that left the Gulf before the war started due to arrive, I think I saw from Ed Conway this morning that we're speaking on Tuesday that the last tanker with air fuel,
yes, I saw
aviation
that
fuel, is due on Thursday here.
Yeah.
And Britain is particularly, actually all European countries, almost all European countries are particularly dependent on aviation fuel coming out of the Gulf, much more so than they are on crude coming out of the Gulf. And I suspect that that's why we're already seeing the impact on air prices. But it's not going to be that much longer after that, I think, without something changing very rapidly, in which we're going to see the impact on petrol and particularly on diesel prices.
So we'll see that, we'll feel that first, but then of course there's also the impact on fertilizers, on people talk a lot about helium and about the other things that we're used to just getting through the Gulf. So we're now at the point where the idea that there is a global market for any of these things, or a global price even for any of these things, is slightly discredited. The whole conversation about, for example, the global price of gas, that doesn't quite work anymore, does it?
No, you can see it in oil really clearly, and oil is interesting because usually there always are differences between the prices that prevail in Asia and Europe and the United States, but they're usually within a sort of $10 range maybe of each other. But like at one point last week, I think that there was about a 60, even possibly 70 dollar difference between the price for essentially the Indians were paying. India was paying for oil and what the WTI, the effective US price, like was. That's a major difference. That's pretty much twice what the price was at the start of this for the US.
Let's talk a bit about what all this means for the UK. So we've been attempting to head towards a net zero. We've been very clear, or our government has been very clear, or parts of our government have been very clear on what they want from the energy transition. But now that this has happened, it seems to be very clear that we've made ourselves remarkably vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's clear that Britain has a pretty weak energy security strategy. Indeed, one might argue whether there is any real energy security strategy in relation to fossil fuels, which remain, the largest part of our energy consumption.
It's interesting. I'll just interrupt you there because I did just look up before we started to double check the percentage of our energy that is actually oil, not just fossil fuels, but oil, and it's near 40%.
Yeah, it's still And it's still the largest single source of our energy consumption.
And we're well over 70% fossil fuels in general. And there is often when you listen to people discuss energy, there's a tendency to confuse energy and electricity, right? And we'll often be told that 60% of our energy or 40% of our 70% of our energy on any particular day comes from renewables. But what people actually mean when they say that is not energy, but electricity. Whereas in fact, we remain, like all economies, fully based on fossil fuel use.
I mean, electricity is a little bit more than 20% of the UK's overall energy consumption. If you look at like fossil fuel energy consumption, only 13% of it actually goes to electricity. So you can have a strategy for electricity, you can have a strategy for electricity security, but it can't be the same, just as a matter of logic, as an energy security strategy. And if you say, which is really, I guess, the Ed Miliband, position, which is, well, actually you can't have energy security for fossil fuel energy, to which actually that argument in itself I have some sympathy for. There is something that actually is a roller coaster and has long been a roller coaster about fossil fuel energy consumption. Certainly once oil came into the picture. But nonetheless, is that if you are going to have a strategy to change that, then it has to be simultaneously a strategy for decarbonising electricity and for electrification. It involves the electrification of those things that we're presently using oil and gas for. And if you look at the present government in Britain's energy policies, almost all of it is directed at electricity, and very little of it is directed at electrification. So even in its own terms, that is a problem. And this phrase, clean power is like bandied around. I think the power is I'm not saying a deliberate obfuscation. I don't think that, but it confuses, because power in energy terms isn't a meaningful term. We should be talking about energy, or we should be talking about electricity.
And the different things. Yeah. And the idea of trying to electrify more than we have already would be hugely expensive. It's a whole different strategy.
Actually, in terms of certain things, is though where we were, in principle at least, there are easy wins. We're not even doing that. I mean, if you look at electric trains in this country, the electrification of the rail network, I think it's under 50% actually of our rail network is actually electrified. This is something that's stalled, for a long time in this country, because actually it's not difficult to do. I mean by that technologically, difficult is an absolutely known thing to do for obvious reasons. We've already got electrified track. That's an obvious thing to do, but actually, as far as I can see, the government doesn't actually have a strategy for the complete electrification of the railways.
So I suppose what we in the UK have learned, for those of us who didn't know it already, is that the fossil fuels market is extraordinarily unstable and will remain unstable and has always been unstable. You kind of have to live with that, because nonetheless fossil fuels create the foundation of our economy completely. So how do we in the UK try and stabilize our own supply of fossil fuels. And one of the things that this whole thing is brought up is this argument again about the North Sea. So you have one side of the political world saying, well, what this tells us is that we must go further and faster with our attempt to use renewables. And the other side of the argument, well, yeah, let's do that. But at the same time, why don't we encourage more exploration and production in the North Sea? And why don't we actually move ahead with some fracking to the extent that it's now possible? Let's bump up our own production of fossil fuels because that will make us more secure. Where do you come down on that?
Well, I mean, I'm generally of the view that we need to be very open-minded about the North Sea, and that we really need to get out of this binary that we've got into of it's like fossil fuels versus renewables. And Keir Starmer was using that like the other day, and for the reasons that we've just been talking about, Merryn, it doesn't even make sense in its like own terms. Because right now is you can't substitute renewables for most of the things that fossil fuels are doing for us, just because of the way that we set things up. You can only think of that mindset about electricity, and that only applies to gas, given that we don't use oil for electricity. I think that what we have to bear in mind, though, is that the North Sea isn't going to be, or doing more in the North Sea, which I'm in favour of, isn't going to be a panacea. Because to get some of the benefits of that, we've got to revisit some of the policies that we put in place, like decades ago, in the way in which we treat the North Sea. I mean, for one of the things that we do, obviously, is to export about 80% of oil that we produce in the North Sea, and we do that because we don't have refineries in this country that can actually deal that well with the kind of oil that now comes out, the kind of crude that now comes out of the North Sea. And I think this whole issue about what we do about refineries is actually a bigger picture than that too. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we're in this position of importing as much aviation fuel as we do from the Persian Gulf, because our refineries, we've only got 4 oil refineries left. They're not set up to do that.
And why don't we have refineries anymore, given that we produce oil?
I think I'm right in saying is we haven't opened a new refinery since 1969, I want to say. And that we closed another one. They've been closing down, for several decades now. So Grangemouth in Scotland closed last
which
year.
did it's produce
one of those
aviation fuel, didn't it?
Yeah, one of those oddities of when we had the boon of North Sea. So the North Sea, the major North Sea oil discovery was 1970. The year after we last opened a refinery. That didn't go hand in hand with saying that we need a strong refining, domestic refining operation. The North Sea was from the start quite orientated to production for world markets. And then on the gas side is we've set up a way of pricing that effectively means that the gas that we do consume from the North Sea, we end up paying pretty much the same as if we were consuming it from liquefied natural gas purchases in the global market. So again, if we want to get the benefit, the macroeconomic benefit, or the economic benefit from more domestic gas production, which is would be a good thing, we've also got to look at the way in which we deal with gas in relation to the electricity, at least in relation to electricity. So there's a lot of things that are coming in terms of the decisions that were made in British energy policy for decades, not just the last decade and a half or so, that are really coming home to roost. There's a complacency, I think, that we had through the North Sea years, through the boom North Sea years, I mean by that, which was that markets and the global markets would be the solution to energy security, and it's just not the case that they are.
But all these things, these are policy choices, right? So while it may take time, pretty much all these things can be reversed. It would be possible for the UK to reintroduce a fairly hefty element of energy security over, say, a 5-year period.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we need is a rethink of a whole set of things that we do in energy policy. That I think it starts to make sense if you think in the 90s that the UK across parties, who wasn't dependent on which political party was, in office, made a bet essentially that there wasn't really serious geopolitical risk attached to energy, and then that's why the markets, plus some regulation, could do the work, and that the state stayed out of it. Essentially, even to the point where we got rid of having an energy secretary in the 1990s. We only got one back in, I think it was 2008. Energy was just consumed under the Department of Trade and Industry. I think that we embraced, in a way, much more than the Americans did, this notion that markets were the solution to all energy questions. And I'm not saying that markets aren't the solution to some energy questions, but the idea that the state can just be completely largely hands off, and that doesn't have to deal with geopolitical risk and supply chain risk. I think that that's turned out to be an incredibly dangerous illusion, and naive as well.
So if you could start tomorrow, let's say that you had Ed Miliband's job, we'd all quite like that. What would you do immediately?
I mean, I think you have to review everything, and I'm not saying that because I think that you actually have to throw everything out. I mean, I think that in this respect, Ed Miliband is right. Is the energy transition is necessary to improve long-term energy security, as well as the climate change issue. But you have to be able to think about the short term and the medium term, as well as the long term. And I think that that's where we are, in some sense, imprisoned. And this is where I think that the net zero question does come into play, because what net zero did, not just from the 2019 legislation, but from the Climate Change Act back in 2008, is create a pretty strict legal framework in which energy questions really have to be thought about legally through emissions, through carbon emissions. And then that makes it actually quite difficult to adjust, to actually review everything, because we've got a whole set of priors that are legally built into the way in which energy policy must be considered. I mean, I think that there are, the easy win, if you like, would be to make a decision on Rosebank and Jackdaw, the fields in the North Sea, where the government or the energy secretary has been sitting on for quite some time now without making a decision, make a quick decision about that to allow them to go ahead. That would be a start.
There have been a lot of losers and not so many winners from this war so far, but one of the big winners here seems to be coal.
Certainly in Asia. I mean, I think that this is what's actually quite revealing about Europe's weakness, and it isn't just about Britain, though. Britain actually, I think, is probably exhibit A where coal is concerned, because we don't have any coal powered reactors left. We closed the last one down at Ratcliffe and saw a few years ago. What happens in Asia, certainly in China and in India, and Japan for that, and South Korea, actually, quite all the larger economies, is when the price of liquefied natural gas is too much. They switch for electricity purposes to more coal, and that is not an option for European countries. Certainly not an option for ours. And again, I think it goes back to Britain's structural weakness. Is there are things you can fall back on in the emergency that are reliable. Coal is one, nuclear is another, and hydropower is another. And Britain has relatively little of those three things. As we know, we haven't finished building a nuclear reactor since the middle of the 1990s, when Sizewell B opened. At the moment, Hinkley Point C looks maybe like 2030. We don't have a coal power station, and we don't have a country that's well suited at all to hydro power. So that makes us structurally vulnerable. And we simply do not have the options of, in the emergency, burn coal that Asian countries and some European countries still have.
Yes, we've just removed for policy reasons, removed the optionality from our system.
Yeah, and we're very, we're very locked in from a set of accumulated set of decisions that I'd say have been made in a way going back to the 70s even.
Well, this is
certainly
depressing.
Since the 90s.
This is really depressing. What about fracking? I mean, that conversation has come up again in the UK, and we saw the phenomenal success it's been in the US, which of course is fairly insulated from their own war because they have this phenomenal energy security in the US, which we obviously don't have. Would it make sense for us to pick up that conversation seriously again?
I think the thing that's difficult about like fracking in Europe is like if you look in the earlier part of the 2010s, and there was a lot of hope placed, particularly actually in Poland and to some extent in Ukraine, and it's actually an interesting part of the whole Russia-Ukraine story about fracking, and you see the US companies like involved in that. You actually see, I think that the Obama administration was pretty keen on pushing like fracking like in Europe. Poland looked the most propitious, but actually quite a lot of money was like spent there, and quite simply, the rocks don't fracture in the same way.
We have different kinds of rocks.
Yeah, the geological prospects of fracking in Europe are just not the same as they are in the United States. Now, that isn't necessarily to say that the whole thing is just a write-off and not to be like pursued or thought about, but I don't think we should be under any illusions here. As I say, if you look in the Polish case, there was a lot invested for in the end no reward. So just because that there are like shale deposits, it does not mean that fracking in a European country is a commercially viable proposition.
Helen, is there any chance that we can end our conversation on a note of optimism?
Where would you like to go, Merryn?
I literally anywhere at this point. Is there anything that we can say that is hopeful for the UK when it comes to energy security or for our future?
One thing I do think is that the level of like understanding about energy questions in our politics, I think is rising like really considerably.
Well, thank goodness.
And I've been talking about like energy, on podcasts in one way or another since about 2016, 17, when I was doing Talking Politics. And to be honest, when I used to mention it like then, I always thought like people would just think, what on earth is going on about? And then there was a big change for obvious reasons, like in 2022, like with Russia's like invasion of Ukraine, and then I think it like faded away again. But now we've had, in some ways, in supply terms, the biggest energy like shock of peacetime that there has been, and I don't think it will fade away quite so much like this time. I think that we're actually reached a point, in some sense, like of no return, where the reckoning, if you like, is concerned. And that, I think, for the UK is a good thing, because we've got to like undo like a mindset that essentially left us with out an energy strategy, or without an energy strategy in the world as it was, rather than the world as policymakers wanted it to be. And now the world's hit us, and we have to be serious. And I think that's a good thing. I think you can see movement on the nuclear issue. In terms of the willingness to face what it actually would mean to get more nuclear reactors like built. I think there has been movement from the Starmer government on that issue. So I think that those are good things.
Okay, so the conversation has become serious, so we can file this under better late than never.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us today. It's been
an absolute pleasure.